This program has been made possible by the following sponsors. The U.S. Resiliency Council, where our vision is a world in which we not only have a low impact on the environment, but the environment has a low impact on us. The USRC's mission is to create more resilient communities, one building at a time. Learn more at usrc.org. Derived from NASA technology, Taylor Devices develops energy dissipation products in buildings, bridges, and structures around the world, specializing in shock and vibration control since 1955. More information is available at taylordevices.com. DLR Group is a global integrated design firm whose brand promise is to elevate the human experience through design. Learn more at dlrgroup.com. SidePlate Systems provides bolted moment frame design solutions for steel building structures that saves steel and erection time. More information at sideplate.com.
A big earthquake is inevitable in Los Angeles.
In your lifetimes, we are going to see the magnitude 7, magnitude 8.
Can't explain. I'm just lucky to be alive.
There won't be an all clear. There will be earthquakes occurring all over the place.
Casualties, chaos.
No lights, no more cell phone coverage, no civilizations left. Nothing.
The whistle. Are we ready for the big one?
All I see here is a parched creek, a dry ditch. This trench might not seem that impressive from this immediate angle at this present time. It seems like it could be a man-made excavation, that nobody could make this or stop it from moving. This is the San Andreas.
Earthquakes are a reality for California. San Bernardino is home to one of the most famous earthquake faults in all of California, the San Andreas Fault.
The Pacific Plate is moving north towards San Francisco at about 2 inches a year, about the rate your fingernails grow. But on the surface, the plates lock at the faults. Where the plates don't move, they accumulate tension. And then they move all at once. This creek is displaced. All the creeks are displaced.
This is Wallace Creek. The San Andreas Fault comes right through here and has these very classic examples of offset streams. At one time, eastern and western Wallace Creek were one straight creek that crossed down off the mountain. And since then, they've moved apart. So the last earthquake here was in 1857, and the ground moved 31 feet sideways.
And you can measure that precisely?
Yes, because we've tested the soils and been able to date those with carbon-14, and because of very accurate mapping done by these seismologists, they're able to tell us that story. We know it is going to happen, and it could happen today. In the next earthquake, Wallace Creek will grow by 100 to 30 feet.
This shake, the mother of all temblors, the big one, is overdue, and it could happen anytime, any day, or any moment. San Bernardino and Riverside are known as the Inland Empire. They have a joint population of over 4.5 million people. The Inland Empire stretches from Arizona and Nevada to Los Angeles and San Diego. With over 20,000 square feet, San Bernardino is the largest county in the United States. With fresh water and sunshine, these lands have been inhabited since time immemorial by Native Americans, and later by Spain, Mexico, East Coast and European migrations, and the United States since 1850. Over 19 million people live in Southern California. And California is the 5th largest economy in the world. And yet, we live next to faults.
Were it not for the San Andreas and the Hayward Fault, there would be no San Francisco Bay, the only deepwater port along the entire California coastline, and for that reason, it was the wellspring of the gold rush in 1849. A bend in the San Andreas thrust up the Santa Cruz Mountains, the spine of the peninsula, and the Miranda Headlands. And these coastal ranges bathe us in fog and crown us in redwoods. We live here because it's beautiful.
Same for the Inland Empire.
That's exactly right. The Inland Empire is another landscape that's completely fault-produced.
I wrote this story today about how there's an earthquake fault underneath Rodeo Drive. That's the thing about Los Angeles. One of the best places to build buildings with views is right next to an earthquake fault. Some of the most iconic locations throughout LA are right on faults. Tower Records building in Hollywood is in the fault zone. The Sunset Strip is in an earthquake fault zone. The Mormon Temple's in the earthquake fault zone.
Not only is in San Bernardino, are you close to San Andreas here, but you're also close to the San Jacinto Fault, and you're also close to the San Gabriel's Sierra Madre Fault. So you have 3 faults that could strongly shake the region, plus it's a deep trough of sediments. It's just like pouring sand on a drum skin and beating the drum.
How often do earthquakes happen along the San Andreas?
About once every 150 years. In the 80 years that we've been recording earthquakes here in Southern California with this seismic network, we've never seen one that's actually on the San Andreas Fault. We think there's actually a paradoxical situation that because the fault is so weak, it only has the biggest earthquakes.
What do you mean the fault is so weak?
Okay, so when an earthquake happens, you slip over a fault surface. And if it slips a little ways and runs into something that stops it, it's a small earthquake. If it runs a long ways, it becomes a bigger earthquake. And it's the length of the fault that determines the magnitude of the earthquake. At this point, because we don't see any small earthquakes on the San Andreas down here, we think that once an earthquake begins on it, it just becomes a big earthquake.
We could have a situation where a San Andreas earthquake triggers an earthquake much closer to LA, much closer to Riverside. So we shouldn't think of earthquakes as occurring in isolation.
Really? So a movement on the San Andreas can trigger a movement on the San Jacinto?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact,
like quickly?
Very quickly, or after several years. There won't be an all clear. There will be earthquakes occurring all over the place.
We've seen that large earthquakes happen on long faults. The San Andreas produces large earthquakes every 150 years, and that hasn't happened in the middle part since 1857, and in the southern part since 1680. It's the next big rupture that could be the big one. The San Andreas could activate other faults, like the Hayward in San Francisco or the San Jacinto in the Inland Empire.
Can't explain, I'm just lucky to be alive.
The last major earthquake in California was in Northridge in 1994. Many might not remember, but what kind of damage can an earthquake cause? The Richter scale was created in 1935 by Charles Richter, right here at Caltech. It measures the distance and amplitude of the seismic wave. That's why each increase in number represents a 10-fold increase in wave amplitude. A 7.0 is 10 times larger than a 6.0, and 100 times larger than a 5.0. Each increase in number also releases 31 times more energy. If we compare a 4.5, fairly frequent, and a 7.5, the 7.5 would be 1,000 times larger. That's the difference between walking a mile and walking from San Bernardino to Portland, Oregon. If we look at it in terms of strength, that's the difference between lifting a pound of sugar and lifting a bus.
The force that released an earthquake is bigger than any atomic bomb we've ever set off. The biggest hydrogen bombs that we set back when we were blowing up really big ones, in the testing, was about a magnitude 7. A magnitude 6 can destroy your house when it's right underneath you. What's different in the 8 is that not just your house is destroyed, but so is the houses of millions of other people.
Mexico City, September 19th, 2017. At 1:14 in the afternoon, the ground started shaking. A 7.1 earthquake struck 34 miles south in the city of Puebla. The ground shook for 20 seconds. Many buildings had not been retrofitted, and 40 buildings collapsed. Overall, 370 people were killed, and there were over 6,000 injured.
When the Mexico earthquake hit, I went down there to see what I could learn and what California could learn from it. And it was the first time I had been to the collapse of a brittle concrete building, and it was heart-wrenching. I mean, you saw basically a 7-story building get smashed into a 2- or 3-story space.
Our mission is to understand what happened to the Mexico City and understand the lessons from that earthquake to apply it in California. Here's I'm in the school here. As you can see, totally destroyed. This thing's built in only 20 years ago, 1990s. It's unbelievably dangerous.
What parallels and what lessons can we find in Mexico bringing to Los Angeles or to Southern California?
Older concrete buildings are really dangerous. What happens is start shaking it, it pops. Once it pops, everything just comes off and everything collapses. Those concrete structures are super dangerous. That's what we saw in Mexico City. We will see here in California.
In a city like Los Angeles, more than 90% of buildings were built before the 1990s. A lot of buildings, especially taller buildings, older buildings, are made of brittle, or we call it non-ductile concrete or steel. And so, yes, these buildings don't have the kind of reinforcing steel you'd expect in a building that was built today, and they could be at significant risk.
Japan is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. They're among the best prepared for earthquakes. In March 2011, Japan experiences its largest earthquake ever, a massive undersea mega thrust with magnitude 9.1. The fault was 250 miles long. This earthquake moved the entire main island of Japan by 8 feet.
Whole Tokyo shut down completely. And Tokyo is like 200 miles away from the epicenter even, right? But we have no civilizations left, nothing. No stores open, no food.
The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant was constructed 30 feet above sea level. The land displacement and uplift from the Tohoku earthquake provoked a tsunami waves as high as 133 feet. No one thought this earthquake was possible, until it was. Fukushima was inundated. This caused a hydrogen air explosion. It's one of the worst nuclear disasters in history, rated on par with Chernobyl. Over 6,000 injured and over 16,000 dead. In 2010, a 7.0 strikes Haiti, 16 miles from Port-au-Prince. Weak construction, no building codes. This made this earthquake one of the largest human tragedies of the 21st century. An estimated 3 million people were affected, with a death toll anywhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people. That same year, the southern coast of Chile was hit by one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, a massive 8.8. The shaking lasted for more than 3 minutes, and the earthquake triggered tsunami warnings in 53 countries. About 120 years of accumulated movement slipped all at once. Large parts of the South American continent moved west. Santiago, about 11 inches. In Concepcion, 10 feet. 525 lives were lost.
My mom comes back to the room. She says, forget the computer, forget the TV. So we're walking outside. Light goes immediately off in that second. Okay, this is starting to get bigger, bigger, and bigger. That's the first time ever in my life I've actually seen all the walls move. I had never heard that kind of noise. Not only things falling down and like dishes breaking and things breaking. It was the power of the building moving. You could hear while the whole thing was moving. You could see sparks of light coming from the windows outside of all the transformers exploding. 5 minutes later, we were hit with a 7.6, which was one of the aftershocks. But like after the 8.8, the 7.6 looked like peanuts.
And the only way you get a big one that's going to be like Pan-Pacific is because you've got a subduction zone where one plate's going under the other. Those are where we get the world's largest earthquakes. And then because you're pushing this slab down, and then when the earthquake finally happens, you pop up, you're raising the seafloor, and that the water on top of it also gets pushed up, but it's water, so it falls back down, and that's the wave.
On December 26, 2004, the mother of all earthquakes hit the Indian Ocean coast of Indonesia. The fault ruptured along 900 miles for 9 minutes. The upper plate slid back, upward, and west by as much as 65 feet, elevating islands above the waterline. It displaced the largest volume of water ever recorded. This caused a tsunami that hit Sumatra 25 minutes later. The waves were as high as 100 feet. The effects were devastating. It's one of the worst natural disasters in history. 9,000 foreign tourists, with a total death toll of anywhere between 230 and 280,000. And what about California? This is earthquake country. For those who don't remember, on 1989, October 17th, a 6.9 hit Loma Prieta, 4,000 injuries and 63 deaths. On January 17th, 1994, a 6.7 shook Reseda and Northridge. Highways toppled, apartment houses collapsed. With $44 billion in damages, it was estimated to be the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history until Hurricane Katrina. The Northridge earthquake left 8,700 injured and 57 dead.
Friction has been building on the southern part of the San Andreas Fault. How do we know? A big one has struck before. To learn how the original inhabitants of California used to deal with earthquakes, we talked with James Ramos, past chairman of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians at the San Bernardino County Museum.
So some of your ancestors have been here
oh yeah,
quite a long time, no?
Long time. From time immemorial, that's what we say from the beginning. But Torres Martinez Reservation is here, where the San Andreas, starts over here, goes through. Then you got the Morongo Indian Reservation here. Then you got the San Manuel Indian Reservation here.
How did the Serrano people interpret earthquakes?
It really goes back to part of the creation of the Serrano people, where there was two brothers, Bakr Katat and Kruktat. Bakr Katat was the older brother, and Kruktat sprang from his left shoulder. And the two brothers started quarreling about how to create people. So Bakr Katat went into the middle of the earth, and part of his burden is to hold up the earth. And so every time he shrugs, that's when these earthquakes happen within our territory, within the Serrano people.
Other cultures have also lived with earthquakes over the millennia and have tried to explain them. In Japan, a giant catfish lived in mud beneath the earth and caused earthquakes, but every once in a while, the catfish thrashed about, causing the earth to shake. For the Vikings, earthquakes were explained as the violent struggle with the god Loki, who shook every time venom was dropped on his face. And for the ancient Greeks, Poseidon was the cause and god of earthquakes. When he was in a bad mood, he would strike the ground with his trident to inflict fear. In the West, when a god is supposed to be all merciful and all good, how could you explain earthquakes? Earthquakes were rationalized then to be punishment for our sins. Noah's flood, Sodom and Gomorrah. This has been so ingrained over our centuries that even to this day, it is hard to disassociate earthquakes from human actions.
With all this new data, still, earthquakes are not predictable.
In fact, the more data we get, the more we're getting proof that they're fundamentally random.
Can the moon cycle create earthquakes?
So the moon cycle doesn't create earthquakes.
Can psychics predict earthquakes? Can anybody predict earthquakes?
Nobody can predict earthquakes. I'll get emails and calls from people who say, I know exactly when the next earthquake is going to happen. It just doesn't work like that.
Is there a relationship between climate change and seismology?
So there isn't evidence that any certain type of weather can cause earthquakes, more or fewer earthquakes. Earthquakes occur many miles below the surface of the earth. So when an earthquake is occurring, it doesn't care whether it's windy out. It doesn't care whether it's a little bit hotter than usual or colder than usual.
What is the normalization bias?
In the prehistoric world, if you spent time worrying about a flood that might come in 100 years and ignored the wolf that was about to eat your children, you didn't pass your genes on. So we are very strongly evolved to focus on the immediate crisis.
There's an enemy in short-term thinking. This idea that it's not going to happen to me. It's important to think in the long term because the earthquake will happen.
There was a massive earthquake in the Age of the Enlightenment that challenged the notion of divine punishment. Portugal was an expanding colonial power in Europe. The first encyclopedia had been published in 1751. Its aim was to change the way people think and for people to be able to inform themselves and know things. Knowledge was becoming more universal. In 1755, an 8.5 earthquake off the coast of Portugal rocked Lisbon. 85% of the buildings were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless. An estimated 50,000 perished. It also provoked a change of thought. This was the first earthquake to be studied scientifically, and it led to the birth of early seismology and earthquake engineering.
Lisbon in 1750 was the fourth largest city of Europe. It was a major capital. Portugal was a major colonial power. They had the colony of Brazil, of course, but also other colonies around Asia. Very, very rich. 60% of the city was destroyed between the earthquake and the fire. They had to spend so much money rebuilding. They lost their standing as a major colonial power.
In 1906, San Francisco was the financial and cultural center of the West, the Paris of the Pacific. And then, on April 18th, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake hit off the shore along the San Andreas. The ground shook for 20 seconds. This earthquake released 50 times the energy of Northridge. 80% of the city was wiped out. Out of a total population of just over 400,000, 300,000 people were left homeless. 3,000 people died. It took decades for the city to recover. Los Angeles and Southern California started importing water, and soon after took the helm in leading California forward. The San Francisco quake marked the beginning of seismology in North America.
How often can earthquakes happen? And how often can they happen here?
It wasn't until after the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake that the modern study of seismology really picked up. In 1912, a polar explorer and meteorologist from Germany by the name of Alfred Wegener suggested that continents were slowly drifting around the Earth. Wegener suggested that the continents fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. South America fit into Africa, Australia into Antarctica. Wegener analyzed the rock structure between continents, and he noticed similarities between the rocks and the fossils. He published his theory of continental drift, the origin of continents and oceans, in 1915. How were his findings received? He was ridiculed. Distinguished scientists were outspoken critics. His theory was rejected persistently. Wegener last presented it in 1926, only to be ridiculed again.
Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift, that the continents were drifting apart and they were pushing themselves through the ocean and separating. Well, physically, that's impossible. The ocean floor is denser than the continents, and you could no more push a continent through the ocean than you could push a sponge through a brick. So the physicists laughed at him and ignored it. Right? But he did have a piece of data that hadn't yet been completely explained. Why is there that similarity?
Wagner kept on with his North Pole expeditions. On his 4th expedition to Greenland, at age 50, Wagner tried to survive a vicious snowstorm. He never made it to camp. He and his diary, along with a colleague, are believed to be buried under 300 feet of snow. But his theory of continental drift continued to slowly heat up over the next decades. But if the ocean floor is being created, is it also disappearing?
In the late 50s, early 60s, as they were trying to deal with nuclear proliferation and the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States started negotiating about a test ban treaty. It was easy to say no tests in the atmosphere, because those are easy to see with satellites. But what about the tests in the ground? When an explosion happens in the Earth, it creates waves just like shaking does. But the faults move like this, a bomb moves like this. But you need to have enough stations out there. So they created the Worldwide Seismographic Station Network. It was put in '63. But unlike later advances, that one was not classified. We could now see all the earthquakes of magnitude 5.5 and greater around the world. And suddenly we saw all of these earthquakes in the ocean. And not only did we see them, we could now say what directions were the fault moving. So here in California, the deepest earthquake's only about 20, 25 kilometers deep. Very rare places you'd have more than that. But here we were seeing places under Japan or under Alaska or Chile where they went down to 600 kilometers down. Only in these places where it's young, where it's recently left the surface. Mm-hmm. And so the whole idea of a subduction zone was shown up by finding these deep earthquakes. The network was put in for military reasons, to be sure we could monitor the test ban treaty. But the result was a huge scientific advance, because suddenly we were clearly seeing earthquakes around the world, and it gave us the resolution to see how plate tectonics was fitting together.
A clear map emerged. About 90% of the earthquakes happen on the Ring of Fire.
The Ring of Fire is used to describe the plate boundaries that surround the Pacific Ocean. So around the Ring of Fire, we have, for example, Japan, we have Alaska, Chile, parts of Mexico, Oregon, and the state of Washington. And these are all places where we have subduction zones and active seismicity, because earthquakes, very large earthquakes, occur on those subduction zones.
The surface of the Earth is in constant motion. The surface is broken up into about a dozen kind of very thin shells that are banging around and moving around the surface. In every place they come in contact, we have faults, and those faults produce earthquakes because those plates are being scraped past each other or shoved underneath each other, where the largest earthquakes of the world occur.
So how often do earthquakes happen?
Earthquakes happen every day. In Southern California, we have a seismic network to monitor them, and we've put on an alarm that if we go 12 hours without an earthquake, we ring the alarm because there must be something wrong with the system. We've never seen 12 hours without an earthquake somewhere in Southern California.
Remember the Ring of Fire? We're on it right now. That's where 90% of the world's earthquakes happen. There's about 40,000 earthquakes a year. Most are small and imperceptible. They happen in remote places. We don't get to feel them. There's about 1,000 earthquakes that are above a 6.0, and at least one per year that's above an 8.0. When these earthquakes happen near human population, the consequences can be devastating.
These are some of the recorded earthquakes that happened in just a few months. The last big one here was in San Francisco in 1906, and the southern part of the San Andreas hasn't jolted in almost 340 years.
What does this mean to us, and how dangerous is our current situation?
This model from the United States Geological Survey shows what a 7.2 looks like starting at the Salton Sea. We have a 50% chance of one of these any day in the next 30 years. San Bernardino, Fontana, Rancho Cucamonga, Ontario, Riverside, Corona, they're all built on sedimentary soil. This could make the shaking worse.
A lot of us are worried that there will be major, numbers of building collapses and lives lost because of the lack of retrofitting of these older structures.
When is the big one coming?
The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that there's a 99% chance in the next 30 years that an earthquake as large as the Northridge earthquake will happen somewhere in California, and a 40% chance that an earthquake magnitude 7.5 or larger will occur. So the risk is real. Estimates are that in a magnitude 7 earthquake, a magnitude 8 earthquake, you could have a couple thousand deaths. You could have tens of thousands of people needing shelter, and you could have hundreds of billions of dollars of damage.
We are going to lose Interstate 10, Interstate 15, Route 14, and Interstate 5 depends on how far up the rupture goes. And then basically all of our supply routes are gone.
In Southern California, there are faults that run directly underneath cities, and so there could be many more buildings that collapse. Many people could be homeless because their soft-story wooden apartment buildings have collapsed.
Observation tells us, historic observation, that earthquakes kill people and damage property. And so because we know it is going to happen, and it could happen today, not to be ready today is to be foolish.
When the big one hits, will we have any kind of warning? What do the next seconds, minutes, and hours look like? What emergency plans are in place? Do you know if your loved ones and you live in a building that could collapse? This and more on The Whistle. Are we ready for the big one?
This program has been made possible by the following sponsors: the U.S. Resiliency Council, where our vision is a world in which we not only have a low impact on the environment, but the environment has a low impact on us. The USRC's mission is to create more resilient communities, one building at a time. Learn more at usrc.org. Derived from NASA technology, Taylor Devices develops energy dissipation products in buildings, bridges, and structures around the world, specializing in shock and vibration control since 1955. More information is available at taylordevices.com. DLR Group is a global integrated design firm whose brand promise is to elevate the human experience through design. Learn more at dlrgroup.com. SidePlate Systems provides bolted moment frame design solutions for steel building structures that saves steel and erection time. More information at sideplate.com.